Winchton Board of Selectmen. It is Monday, February 26th, 2023 at 6 p.m. And if you would please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. There's no one in the audience, so there'd be no one else audio or video recording. Selectmen's comments, Mrs. Lapointe?
Just that the middle and high school students and all the staff involved in the cast and crew and stuff did an amazing job this weekend doing Matilda. It was Friday night and Saturday night. If people didn't see it, they really missed out. So great job.
Thank you. Mrs. Anderson?
I would like to thank the DPW workers who have been very diligent plowing, taking care of our roads. We've had like a stretch of really bad weather between snowstorms and freezing cold. And, you know, the guys who actually go out and do the work, I don't think they get enough thank you. And, you know, we're always talking about the department heads and town hall staff, but it's very important to notice the ones who are doing the work, and I guess they didn't get a whole lot of sleep one week.
I'm sure.
And so I'd like to thank them. And then on a side note, I would like to say that, because I wasn't here at our last meeting, just to make note that the sound quality at home was terrible, and you couldn't hear. And so between, you had it on a night where there was a storm and a lot of people didn't have electricity, my cable kept coming in and out, so I wasn't sure if it was a cable or not. So I was texting Amy, but she had the same problem. And that we have to be more aware, because people at home are always interested in what's going on, and they need to be able to hear and see. So hopefully we can correct that in the future.
All right, thank you. Mr. Ward?
Nothing at this time.
Mrs. Salter?
Yes, I wanted to thank the water department. I know there were several people on Saturday that had issues, and I know of two personally that a representative from the water department went out and helped them and showed them where their pipe was frozen and helped them with that, and I'm sure it wasn't just two people that they did that. And not only did they go out, but they were really nice about it and very helpful, and I'd like to thank them. They did a great job.
Good.
And went beyond probably what they needed to, but it's greatly appreciated.
Thank you. And I have nothing at this time. Do we have any public comments and announcements? He may realize he's in the wrong meeting. Okay. New business, special town meeting, March 13th, 2023. We have before us the final draft instead of the final. Mr. Salzbeck?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to run the board through this quickly, and I would like to thank all of you for accommodating me and starting at 6. So there are 6 items on the draft. Starting from the top, committee report, I've had a conversation with Mr. Kane, although I don't know if the Finance Committee intends to put anything forward. Number 2 is prior year bills. We had a $25,000 placeholder on there. We have since narrowed it down to $1,394.86, so a far better figure. The 2 items on there, one is our very own To Each His Own design on Central Street. There was a mix-up with the flowers for Memorial Day. They had invoiced the Legion. The Legion held on to the invoice for a while, and by the time it got to Town Hall, it was already past year end, so we couldn't pay it out. The other one is a little bit of a leftover from a KP law bill. There was a second page that got missed, but they were kind enough to remind us. So that's the second item there. Are there any questions on those? Okay. Under capital articles, we do have a capital purchase, specifically to spend a sum of free cash in the amount of $40,000 for broadcasting equipment upgrades. So this actually goes hand in hand with the complaints about the audio. So this will address that problem.
Well, yeah, because I agree with Barbara. And the other thing I wanted to point out, when you had things up on that screen, you can't see them.
Oh,
Like,
whites
it was
out,
all
yeah,
blurred.
yeah.
It was
You
just
couldn't
an
see it at
awful
all. It was
experience.
terrible.
Okay.
Yep.
So, and I know that, like, I've called in, and the reason why I didn't call in for that meeting is because I can't hear anything. And I don't want to vote on things that I can't even hear. And normally what I do the other times I've called in is I've had the television on, and I listen on the television, and then, talk on the phone, but I didn't have power. That wasn't going to be an option either. But, so hopefully this will get us, so people can hear. I felt bad because other people have complained, and I thought they were kind of being dramatic, and they're not.
Yeah,
No.
no, it's,
We've known it's something to
Yeah.
be addressed, yeah.
yeah, a point well taken, and I think, part of the hang-up here is that when we make expenditures, if there isn't a set appropriation, we can't go out and buy the equipment, so a lot of other issues, we can usually piece something together, we do our best, we're a pretty resourceful group here, but something as specialized as that piece of equipment, we just have to buy that piece of equipment, so that this will help fix that. The other piece is implementing the new system, which some of you may have seen. Mrs. Daigle is still floating around the building like a ghost of executive assistant past. So she is staying on to help usher in some of this new equipment. So a component of that is staff support to help get this online. And we'll drill down on those numbers a little bit more on town meeting floor. Are there any questions about that piece?
I have one question.
Mr. Ward?
Will this equipment update allow us to Zoom these meetings as well as do them live at the same time?
That is correct. So it will fix the audio issues, it will fix the visual issues in terms of getting the screen up, and it will also allow for remote participation, which I know is something that a lot of folks in the community have been clamoring for. So the OWL was supposed to be a good remedy for that. I've yet to see it actually work. So this will address that. That was more of a Band-Aid. This is a long-term fix that should serve the community for some time.
Mrs. Anderson?
So what specifically are we going to be upgrading?
Like half of the actual hardware items in that booth, so not the programs, but actual equipment in that booth. So we do have a couple different quotes from different companies that will address like the Cassis machine and things like that to help us broadcast live. As you may recall, I believe it was around last May, or up until around last May, we were able to broadcast live. That was something that went down, that the timing was horrible because the annual town meeting warrant was already set. And then between then and realistically the special, we were trying to get a consultant to actually come out to Winchendon. So as you can imagine, over the past couple of years, a lot of communities have leaned in heavily on things like remote participation and broadcasting, and we've really relied on that. Well, unfortunately, that created a scarcity in the availability of contractors that are actually willing to come out in our area. So the team that actually historically serviced us for the past decade or so dropped us as a client because they weren't willing to come out this far anymore. So that was a significant obstacle for us. And so once we got that consultant on board, they were able to work with our team, with Linda Daigle, with Don O'Neill, to find something that I think is a realistic fit for us. We don't, there are some communities that have entire PEG centers. We don't necessarily need that, but we need something that actually works, something that's no frills. So I actually did lean on a previous media director specialist I'd worked with in a previous community as well, and he came out for free and provided a little bit of consulting as well to help us kind of figure out what we need to do to right the ship. But we can, when this item comes up on town meeting floor, we can kind of run through a more point for point in terms of the pieces of specific equipment. I'm sure a lot of it's going to be lost on a lot of folks, unfortunately, as it is oftentimes lost on me. But I think it would be nice for someone to really kind of drill down on that.
So can I ask, when you mentioned broadcast live, does that mean somebody can go on our website and actually watch the meetings?
So that was the hang up, is that, and That's exactly what I mean, for the short
Okay,
answer.
because
Yes.
people at home who are watching cable think we are broadcasting live.
Mm-hmm.
So it's real important for other people to understand that this is for internet access.
That is correct, and a lot of people are increasingly cutting the cord with cable, and so that's part of the concern, is that some people, even if they wanted to watch the local access, couldn't.
Right.
Right. And at one point, was it accessible through, like, a Facebook page or something? Or I may be thinking of something else.
As a brief workaround, it went down during, I believe, the school committee debates last year, and somebody quickly in the crowd put it up on Facebook. We've never broadcast through Facebook. The audio and video is typically not ideal, so we didn't bother with that approach.
Okay. I'm sorry, was that it?
Yeah.
You said, thank you. Also, on fixing the audio, you know, as most of us have experienced, to your home, you can't make it here, but you call in, and you can't hear. You can hear the person in front of you. Will it fix that audio? Not just the audio going out, but for someone having to call in? Or will that be replaced by the Zoom? Because I just want to make sure that we'll be able to call in as a member and participate fully.
Right, so calling in was kind of a workaround when the Zoom option went down. Once the Zoom or equivalent option is up in place, that will address that issue as well.
Okay. All right, good. Thank you. Anything else on this one? Thank you.
Article 4, so this is the Parks and Recreation Commission. I've received a lot of feedback on this from folks in the community, and I appreciate it. Effectively, what this is doing is merging, or I guess bringing the parks component back under the recreation umbrella. It's my understanding that in somewhat recent memory it was carved out. But given the large increase in parks and other kind of public spaces we have in town, we did want to have a committee that would specifically provide input. Those areas are traditionally maintained by the DPW, but that was kind of a crucial component. The other piece is expanding the membership from 7 to 9. And so they wanted to get more participation. Now, there are some folks who say they can hardly fill the 7. Why are they increasing to 9? They are also looking to condense. Right now, they have the Recreation Commission, but they also have the Winchton Community Park Committee. Under the Winchton Community Park Committee, they have an infrastructure committee, and they have a programming committee, and they've just kind of like divided themselves up so many times that they hardly have enough people to man all of those areas. And so, kind of bringing it all together and condensing in this way, they feel they can be more effective. There were also some small changes I wanted to highlight. So, for example, it used to previously call out that it would be middle or high school students at the Murdoch, but people have reminded us that there are other, schools in town, but also student age citizens in town that may go to schools outside of the specific Winchton public school system. And so some language was adjusted to address that as well. Are there any questions on that item?
Madam Chair?
Mr. Ward?
Yeah, a couple things. In the previous bylaw, it limited the number of students to one high school, one middle school. This now opens it to any number of students. Are they aware of that? That they are no longer saying how many?
So I believe there's let me see. There's a line in here that should read in so many
Yeah,
ways.
halfway through the second line, the commission shall consist of not more
Not
than
more than 2.
two
Yeah.
middle or high school students.
1A.
That would,
So that would limit it to 2, but it doesn't specify that 1 goes to the middle school or 1 goes to the high school. I think the committee felt that that was overly restrictive. This has been tweaked since the last draft you saw.
Okay, so that's a new change that
Yep.
I didn't see yet.
That was some input from the community that was greatly appreciated.
And this is just for clarification. What is the need to have after the Parks and Recreation Commission on the first paragraph, in parentheses, the commission? What is that even for?
Typically, you'd see that if future reference is made. So, like, for example, number 2, the commission shall. So it's a functional thing that spares them from having to call out every time, Parks and Recreation Commission, Parks and Recreation Commission.
Yeah. To me, it's a waste of space.
Point taken, thank you.
right, anything further on Article 4? All right, Article 5.
Thank you. Article 5 is in many ways the main course for this piece. So this language has been finalized and approved by the Community Preservation Act Exploratory Committee. It's been reviewed, as everything in this, by legal counsel. And we actually had, we were joined by Stuart Sagnor, who's the executive director of the Community Preservation Coalition, with the state join us at their most recent meeting to review this as well, just to make sure. It can be a complex topic if you allow it to be, and so it's good to get those extra set of eyes. There was one important piece from the exploratory committee that I wanted to communicate, and I had sent to the Board of Selectmen over the weekend. There's a letter here penned from Mr. Romanowski on behalf of the Community Preservation Act Exploratory Committee, looking to outline expectations and a request for commitment from both my office and this board. So I can run through it really quickly without going verbatim, but one of the concerns is in terms of the process, if this had approval in the community and if it was implemented, to run you through it quickly. So March 13th, you would have your special town meeting vote, which requires a majority vote. If that passed on May 1st, it would appear on the ballot vote for the annual town election. By that point, we've already set in stone your warrant for the annual town meeting. So you would have to have in place a proposed bylaw, which would be crafted in part by the Community Preservation Act Exploratory Committee. If it failed at the ballot, you would just pass over at a town meeting. If it succeeded at the ballot, then you would vote to implement that bylaw at the annual town meeting. We all with me? So the question that came up from the committee was, well, if we're going to ask the community to vote on implementing the Community Preservation Act in Winchendon, shouldn't we be upfront with them in terms of what the expectations are regarding certain guardrails, in their own words, guidelines, financial best practices, things that there would be an expectation that it'd be implemented before the citizens go, so that they're not just blindly voting on something, tossing the town the keys to the car and saying good luck. There's some bumpers up here. So what they asked was 6 items, and I'll read through them now. That the committee would consist of 9 members, broken down as follows: 5 seats as established by Mass General Law, so automatic under the Community Preservation Act. There needs to be a representative from the Conservation Commission, the Planning Board, the Historic Commission, the Housing Authority, and the Recreation Commission. In Section B, they highlight the remaining 4 seats will be elected, with an underline and an exclamation mark, citizens. Citizens at large with staggered 3-year terms. No appointments will be made by my office or the Board of Selectmen, or any other entity. I know sometimes we have like the moderator, for example, or someone else. They were abundantly clear it was their wish that they would be openly elected citizens. Number 2, if an appointed member from Section A, so the preset 5 folks, conservation, et cetera, resign, they're to be reappointed by their respective appointing authorities. So if the rec person resigns, the rec committee will reappoint a rec. If somebody from Section B, so an elected member, an elected citizen resigns midterm, it would be filled by a member of the community to be appointed by a majority vote of the remaining Community Preservation Commission body. So it wouldn't be appointed by me, the Board of Selectmen. There wouldn't be a recall, a runoff or anything like that. That person would serve out the remainder of that term as appointed by the peers. Number 4, and this is one that they felt was very crucial, no funds will be spent in the first year of implementation. So the group had kind of drawn a line in the sand in that if this were something that got support and if it went through, that there wasn't immediately a rush for the funds and people went on a spending spree. They wanted a chance for the money to come in, to have a thoughtful conversation over a year with the community, to talk about what the community's needs and priorities are, and then it would go to the following annual town meeting. They also asked that the borrowing of CPA funds would not be permitted for any project. So they had a concern that if somebody came in to a potential future Community Preservation Committee in Winchendon and said, I have this project It's a $5 million project. Can you vote to support it and appropriate funds every year for the next 10 years, effectively wiping out everything for 10 years, just for one project? The odds of that happening are slim, but they still had concerns about that occurring, and so they wanted to be clear that if the CPA voted funds, it would be cash upfront, what they had in hand. They would, spend within their means, which is very fiscally conservative, and I support that. So if there were, for example, $1 million project and someone went to the CPA, they could ask the CPA, hey, Robinson Broadhurst kicked in $300,000, the town kicked in $200,000 from pre-cash, could you pick up the remainder from CPA? That's allowable, but you just can't borrow against the CPA funds. And then their last ask is that 5% of the total funds would be budgeted annually for administrative oversight. So that's permitted by Mass General Law, and the unused funds would be returned to the balance annually. So basically, there would be an independent individual annually accounting for and following through on all of these pieces. That's something that gets missed oftentimes on the local level, not just here in Winchendon, but every municipality, is the follow-through. It's that deed that they were supposed to record 10 years ago and they didn't, that type of thing. So there'd be that follow-through. And I apologize, I missed one point in number 4, is that a minimum of 5% of the fund shall remain untouched, always. So they want to always keep building in year over year 5% so that it will accrue, gain interest, and will always kind of be there in case of an emergency. So those are the 6 items that they had requested. They highlighted them as core ideals, and they were asking, once again, that my office sign off on this, which I'm 100% comfortable with and support of. And they asked that the Board of Selectmen would sign off as well. I did mention to Mr. Romanowski, and he incorporated it into this letter, is that this board isn't necessarily all for it. I know it's a split board, and some of you are for it, and some of you aren't. So there's an understanding that this isn't necessarily a support for the implementation of the CPA. It's a support that if it were to go through, you're in support of these fiscally conservative guidelines if something happened moving forward. So with that, if you have any questions, please.
Madam Chair?
Mr. Ward?
Yeah, I have a lot of questions. So I'm just going to start with the one I have with the article itself that's going to be in the warrant. Nowhere in this, and I know what you're going to say, and I'm going to be against it, nowhere in this article does it say we're asking for a 3% surcharge. It doesn't say the amount. Now, I went to the Secretary of State's website, and it says that legislative body must approve the amount of the surcharge. Nowhere in this does it say it. Now, I went back to the May 12, 2014 article, which was passed over the first time this came up, and in that article, after your first 2 lines where it says, Preservation Act by approving a surcharge on real property. In that original one on 2014, it said a surcharge of 3% of the taxes assessed on real property. So everybody knew in the article. So I'm wondering, why isn't that amount in the article so the public knows?
I'm glad you asked the question, because I had asked that question myself. So when I went through this with the gentleman from the state, the executive director, and also legal counsel, I'd asked the same question. The Community Preservation Act Exploratory Committee also asked that same question. And the answer is that the language provided there is, sorry, let me click to the other screen, is activating the Community Preservation Act in town, but it is not establishing the things you listed. So, and there's a handful of them. So not only the 3%, in this instance, it actually call out specifically 2% with 1% to come from a different party. In this instance, hopefully the Robinson Broadhurst Foundation. But it would also call out things like the $100,000 exemption, low income and elderly exemptions, all of those different clauses and components of the Community Preservation Act, the actual act itself, the piece of legislation in Mass General Law, would be called out in the motion, not in the actual warrant article. That's an excellent question. So I think what we can do is make a point of highlighting that I would like to, I mean, typically we get the motion language out in advance. I would like to get it out even sooner, put it out on social media, put it out on the website to really highlight, you know, what the intricacies are of what we're asking here. Because, I mean, the average person off the street, if they read this, wouldn't quite understand what it means. Frankly, I have to read it through a few times to understand what it means. And I think, I hope you've seen historically, I'm a big proponent of trying to boil things down in a way that people can easily understand it. So I'm in support of that sentiment.
Because I can guarantee, I know I will be letting the public know at town meeting exactly what the 3% equates as far as taxes. I will let that be known.
Yep, that's, and just for the record, we're cards up through this whole process. There's nothing to hide. We're not trying to slip anything through, so.
The other questions I have now on this statement that the committee would like us to sign.
Yep.
Well, I guess a few questions on what's in here. Can you explain to me how the 3-year staggered terms are going to occur?
Yeah, so that's typical language, but it's weird when you're starting, because you'd have to either have somebody start with a 3, 4, or 5-year term, or have somebody start with a 1, 2, or 3-year term. And then eventually it would, you know, reset itself year over year. That is gonna be called out specifically in the bylaw that has yet to be crafted, and that's why this letter came forward, is because the work that goes into crafting that bylaw wouldn't realistically start until this approval occurred if it went through at the special town meeting. From that point on, if it passed, that committee would meet the next week. They'd have the green light, and they would start this thing top to bottom, and it would call out specifically, you know, functionally how that would happen. But they wanted to draw a line in the sand and be clear that it would be a 3-year staggered term, but you'd have to start somewhere. So like I said, it would be either a short stint for someone or a long stint. My preference would be short.
And so we're looking at this basically, this is basically an article, this formation of the committee.
I would say it's the rough structure of an article.
And that would be coming up at the May town meeting?
At the May annual,
Town meeting, if all the other wickets. So if that were approved at the May meeting, when is the election going to be held for these people?
So
The following May?
that is correct. So where it would sit for a year, basically that July at the start of the fiscal year would start the actual surcharge, and that would actually fit nicely with their hope that the funds not be touched for a year.
So-
Because that would give a full year for the community to kind of have that conversation about what it would look like forming the Community Preservation Commission and seeking out those additional members.
So we're not looking for any special election
No,
after this?
no added cost, I promise.
And what happens knowing how we can't get people to run for a lot of boards? Now you're asking for 4 members of the public to come forward and run for this in an elected fashion. What if you don't get those seats? What if nobody runs? Say 1 or 2.
Right, so I had raised that concern, something that we see pretty frequently. I mean, my other concern was if you have, I mean, it's staggered seats, so the initial year is gonna be tough because you're trying to get 4, but after that, you're gonna be staggered, so it won't
Right.
be as hard. But, you know, what if you find 3 people that are really interested, you find a 4th that's sort of interested, and they can just get 5 buddies to write their name in, and now all of a sudden they're on the Community Preservation Commission. It was a concern that I had expressed as well, but from what I heard from the committee, including honestly members of that committee themselves, that there is a wealth of citizen seats on that exploratory committee that may express interest in running. But I think the other component is, I can't think of another board or committee that functionally we have discussed this much as a community, at least in the 2 years I've been here. And so I think that may drum up interest. Like, we don't talk every other meeting about the fence viewer, right? or what they do or what that means, but we've been talking about the Community Preservation Act pretty much since the day I sat in that seat and interviewed for this job. So it'd be my hope that the community would have an understanding of what it is and that there may actually be interest. I think the other component is, nothing against the fence viewer, not to pick on them, but I think the Community Preservation Act is far more interesting. It's a multifaceted program, and it would impact a lot of areas that I think a lot of people care about. I mean, the four things that they hold up as priorities, housing, recreation, open space, historic preservation. I think you're tapping into a really broad subsection of the community. So maybe I'm just being bright-eyed and optimistic, but I think people would come out and really try to fight for those seats.
My only concern is if you don't get somebody to run, even if it's one, and your bylaw now says you have, what is this, 9 members?
Yes.
Your quorum is still 5. No matter if you have 7 members, it's still 5. So they need to be aware of that. My next question, what is included in administrative oversight costs, this 5% that could?
Sure. So, and just real quick to touch on the other point, if they failed to get quorum, it's probably one of the best worst-case scenarios you could find, because all that would happen is that money would continue to be saved away. So that's the worst-case outcome if they failed to get quorum. The administrative fee, 5%, I've yet, in my experience, to see a community use that full 5% administrative fee, but it's a consulting fee. So you would be hiring out somebody or a firm that specializes in the Community Preservation Act, but specifically the reporting that comes from this. And I think we had touched on this in a previous meeting, or it may have been with the Exploratory Committee, but the level of oversight that you see on a CPC project compared to typical oversight, far more hoops than what you would usually see. Reason being is that every project, half of that funding or so, depending on the community, but half in Winchendon for the time being, would be state funds, and they hold you accountable to every single penny that goes through from the time the project starts to the time the project is finished. So that's a lot of extra work. In my previous community, that fell to the office that I was in, and we would do that reporting. It was very time consuming. The committee had requested, and once again, in an effort to insulate these funds for my office and from the board and from what they would call the typical town operations, they felt it would be important that the Community Preservation Commission, or potential future Community Preservation Commission, sought that out and controlled it themselves, in the same way that I don't hire the auditor. They would want to hire a consultant for CPC reporting.
And I guess my final issue, and this is on the form itself, signing the form. Because basically this is, in a pretty good form, it's going to be the formation of the committee. It's going to be an article in the May town meeting. And traditionally, myself and a few others on this board have insisted that we do not vote until there's been the public hearing, and the Finance Committee has also looked at it and given their vote, and we always now vote after. What this is asking is for us to, before we hear any public comments, any public opinion, before we hear what the Finance Committee, what the public hearing's coming out, to sign and say, we're okay with this. Now, I've stated clearly where I am. I support this financially. I think it's a good deal. I've also stated I don't want the boss having any handle on this at all, and this clearly states it. But I can't go against what I've been pushing all along, that I don't sign, approve things before we've had the public hearing. So I will not be signing this document. I will be waiting till the public hearing and the input from the public, and then I will let folks know what I think of it. That's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Ward. So, working backwards from the May 15th annual town meeting, when would those public hearings be held? When would the Finance Committee public hearing be?
To form the bylaw?
Just-
I'm sorry.
It'd probably be in April, right?
So.
April or early May.
So if I could recommend a remedy. So the intent of this letter from the Exploratory Committee was to have this for the special on March 13th.
Right.
There's so many different ones going on right now. That was their intent. So, but I think something that might satisfy Mr. Ward is there's the finance committee is going to be weighing in on this component tomorrow night. In fact, if you look at the warrant itself, there are several boards and committees that are going to be weighing in on this, just given the reach of the piece of legislation. So I think if it would satisfy Mr. Ward and if it would please the group, I think that's an excellent point that you've brought up. And there are a handful of financial components to the letter that they did request, and I think it would be nice and respectful to ask the Finance Committee's opinion on those before this board signed on to it. And as a matter of fact, I'll hold off and do the same. And so it may be a matter of maybe at the time that this board votes their recommendation, which follows the hearing from the Finance Committee, if you're in support of what the Exploratory Committee is requesting, and if the Finance Committee is in support of it, then maybe that's the appropriate time.
Because when are we're doing that on
The hearing is tomorrow evening, the 7th.
the Finance Committee? Okay.
Correct.
So we're making our recommendations next Monday.
Mhm.
So a week from today, we will have the Finance Committee input on it.
But I might point out that the public hearing tomorrow night is for Article 5, Community Preservation Act. The community is not getting, or the Finance Committee is not putting input on the proposed formation of the committee. That's a letter that came to us, not the Finance Committee. It's not to the public. They're just talking about this Conservation Act, not about the formation, what the bylaw is going to look like, because that's coming up in May. And that's going to be, the public hearing will be towards the end of April, beginning of May for that article.
Sure. So, I mean, I guess in the same way that letter wasn't specifically called out on the agenda this evening, is because from where I sit, it's very much included under the same umbrella. It's part of the conversation. That whole article sprung forth from a recommendation from the Community Preservation Act Exploratory Committee. So I understand what you're saying, but on the other hand, I wouldn't see any harm in the Finance Committee weighing in on that. The other component is, and I wouldn't want to speak for the Finance Committee, and I never would, but financially, the things that the Community Preservation Act Exploratory Committee are requesting are not financially outlandish. If anything, I think they would all fall in the category of a financial best practice. I'll let them express that, and I'm sure they'll have different takes on it within the room, but I see and hear your concern, but in terms of the timing of it all, it would be helpful if this board acted at your upcoming meeting on Monday.
Has the Exploratory Committee, are they planning on approaching any of these other boards and committees with a request to support this letter of support, out of curiosity?
Yes, so not for that specific piece, although I suppose they could, but they're going before every board and committee listed on there in an upcoming meeting between now right up through until, I believe, March 6th. This is the last one that's going to come in just due to the timing. So there'll be full recommendations in time for hitting the town meeting floor, but there's not going to be full recommendations in time for your meeting next Monday, just given the amount of them and coordination.
Okay. No, I guess I was referring to specifically this letter of support. They addressed one to the Board of Selectmen. Will they be requesting a letter of support from the Finance Committee or from any of the other committees initially?
Okay, I understand you. So for that letter specifically, from the jump, the Exploratory Committee, or members of it in particular, but they do have a consensus on it, their largest concern about the Community Preservation Act in relation to Winchendon is that those funds would go through what they call the typical process. And there are folks on that Exploratory Committee that do not like the typical process. And I will be the first to admit it's not perfect, but it's the best we have. And so it was a priority for that group to, I guess, display to the community at large that there's going to be a firewall and a separation between the Community Preservation Commission and the funds that go to it and the causes that they fund and what they would call the typical town operations. And their concern was always specifically my office and your office. But they didn't bring up any of the others.
Well, I would like to think that this is not addressed solely to the Board of Selectmen for solely that purpose, that they feel that they need to put up that firewall. But my thought was, if they're looking for support prior to, the ballot and the election and everything, would the support of the Finance Committee also be important? So that's,
And I would,
if this is why they, go ahead.
I apologize. So just to specify, when I first, or when they first approached me about this, I'll admit it took me, a half a second longer than typical to put ego aside on that one, and not feel personally attacked. But I would say, the message I would communicate to this board as well is that it's more so a function of, I think, of the power that your board wields compared to the others in terms of your ability, if you wanted to find some ways to steer that funding. And they kind of wanted to keep it, from a purity standpoint, they wanted it to be an extremely citizen-driven initiative, but it's no reflection on any of you as individuals or myself.
And I think the citizen participation would be fantastic, absolutely. But before I ask if there's anyone else, another question I had, number 3, should an elected member from Section B resign, shall be filled by the majority vote of the remaining body. Is there anything in Mass General Law about elected positions that state that that they have the authority to fill that position from within, or does it have to go out for a re-election or remain empty until such time as there is another election?
Mm-hmm. So we actually just ran into a similar scenario with a vacancy on the school committee about a year ago, or maybe a year and a half ago now, where Mr. Barbaro came back for a brief stint on the school committee, and that was from a vote of the body. So it is permitted.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mrs. Anderson?
Not sure that's correct, because that particular position was a joint of the school committee, Board of Selectmen, and moderator, I believe, to appoint that school committee position. So it didn't just come within the body.
Oh, so are you saying that didn't come exclusively from the school committee?
No.
Right, yeah,
Sure.
because it was a tri-board where we
Yes.
voted to,
But I think that was
With the moderator, and that's what our charter states.
So that's what I was going to say. That's, I think, as outlined in the charter. So that's bylaw driven. So this bylaw could be written, and I'll check with legal counsel. But I guess what I'm saying is there's precedent that you don't always have to go back to a runoff election, I guess,
Okay.
to clarify.
yeah, just as long as protocol is followed,
Yep.
whatever that
But-
protocol is, okay.
But that piece and all the others, and I stress this to the exploratory committee too, is I wouldn't say full-blown, they're putting the cart before the horse, but all of these aspects are gonna be vetted, between,
Understand, yeah.
potentially, if it passes on March 13th, between then and May, extensively. And that's really the time when the bulk of the work is happening. Even signing on to this letter, I'd expressed to the committee, well, what if you change your opinion? And now we're beholden to this letter, and I think they included a line in there saying that, if they change their opinion or if something happens. But they just wanted, I think, as a first pass, just to kind of draw a line in the sand and make sure that everybody was kind of in agreement with those pieces, which they're not terribly controversial, but I could see where folks might not want to be beholden to them necessarily without going through that whole process that would occur between March and May, potentially.
And actually, I do see that in here, but I would want to add something. The very last sentence of the letter states, should the CPAEC change direction on any of these components, notice will be respectfully provided to the Board of Selectmen. it tells, doesn't, but then it doesn't say it gives us the option of changing our support based upon any changes that they make. It just says, they'll notify us of any changes, and we just have to take it. Is that important?
Could be.
To have that, still have that veto ability at that point if they come back with something very drastic?
You could say it would be subject to a revote. I think that was the intent.
Thank
That's
you.
how I took it. I could ask Mr. Romanowski if he'd be willing to rework that last line. And I'm sure that they would be agreeable. This is, you know, I could see where this may be perceived as a bit of a strong arm, which you know, I personally hate when people do that, but I think their intent is very much from a place of partnership. I think it just comes across strongly worded because this is a very passionate group. And they've put a lot of work into this, so I think they're very
Yeah, they have.
protective at the goal line here of the football, so.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Mrs. Lapointe?
I'm personally very much in support of differentiating the two, so if you could relay that they will get a motion for a vote of support from me at our next meeting if they're able to just tweak the couple little things.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything further from the board for this evening? No. All right, so this will be on our agenda for next week.
Perfect.
All right, thank you.
And then Article 6, this is just the non-binding referendum, so I went back and forth with this with Attorney Sirigu on Saturday. Just trying to figure out a way to get the question in a spot that makes sense, because functionally it needs to be in a yes or no format. So we opted for a yes being to spend more money down the road to be determined to increase the water level, and a no vote would be to go with the cheaper route that would allow us to shore it up now, but it would keep water levels where they are right now. So are there any questions on that?
Madam Chair,
Mr. Ward?
just a couple questions, and this really has to do with actual town meeting when you discuss this. The folks are going to have to know what is the estimated cost to keep it at the level it is now. And I've read that it's much more costly to bring that water level back to where it originally was.
Right.
So they're going to have to know what those cost parameters are. And also, what are the benefits of bringing it back to its original level?
Sure,
Pros and
so,
cons. Yeah.
So the pros and cons. If those aren't clear,
Yeah.
this to me is meaningless.
Yeah, Justin and I have spoken about this, and that's something that we've talked about, is making sure, what are we gonna, if we spend the money, what do we get for it? Versus if we don't spend the money, what do we have? Yeah,
and we do have some early numbers from the engineers, and they're finalizing them now, so we should have something in time on town meeting floor. And there would be, like I said, there would be a ballpark, just to give you an idea. In terms of the pros and cons, I could probably rattle off a list. I think our DPW director could as well, our public safety folks could as well. And I think a big piece of it all kind of depends on who you ask. I think people that live on that body of water could list off pros that wouldn't really, apply to most residents that don't live on the water. We being the town or a property owner with Ingleside down there on that body of water. Grout Park abuts that body of water. That body of water is tangled all throughout this community. So I think it all depends on who you ask. We can get something together, but I don't think it's going to scratch the surface in terms of the conversation that's probably going to happen on town meeting floor. But I think a lot of that kind of, by design, that's the intent, I think, of this article, is to get people talking about it and to realistically, get their feedback. I had a few people stop by my office today separately to talk about it, and I think people are interested. And what I expressed to one of those individuals today is that when I got to town, I heard it was basically like three things. The roads are horrible, we want a grocery store, and what's going on with that big dam. And that, I hear about that all the time. So if we can provide some type of platform for people to have that conversation, then I'm happy to do it.
anything further? Mrs. Anderson?
I'm trying to figure out why you would have an article on there to see if they want to recommend that we seek grants. We always seek grants.
So that's a good point, and I guess we do aggressively seek out grants all the time, but I think it's more of a time sensitivity thing is a component as well. So if people wanted to go the cheaper route, we could probably swing that and do that work within a year or two. If they said, no, let's hold off, go get grants, well, we could potentially get a grant for it maybe in the next 10 years. So there's a little bit of like a crossroads that we're at with the engineer. This question sprung forth because the engineer asked Mr. Croto, Mr. Croto asked me, and I asked the chair.
Yeah.
It kind of rolled uphill, trying to figure out a direction on this. But the crossroads that the engineers are at before they continue designing something, they need that direction from the community. So that's kind of the time sensitivity piece. So if the community does opt to go that more expensive route, that's fine, but we don't have the money to do it right now, I think is the most important piece to hammer home.
But the engineer needs to know if we're going to do it down the road, so because that will affect what he's doing now.
In terms of the plans, and realistically,
Right.
we need the plans to go for the grants. So,
So when Justin brought this to me, it was, okay, how can we find out what the citizens want, rather than putting on a full article? So we just made it, well, we did make it an article, but just a non-binding referendum to find out from the townspeople what direction they wanted to go on the pond. Did that answer your question?
Sure.
Anything further on the warrant? All right, seeing and hearing none, I'll entertain a motion.
Madam Chair,
Mr. Ward,
I move to approve the March 13th, 2023 special town meeting warrant as presented this evening.
Second.
thank you. Made and seconded to approve. Any further discussion? Seeing and hearing none, all in favor say aye,
Aye.
and the chair votes aye. Now, at what point will you have
I have all the.
copies for us to sign of that last page? Okay, thank you.
and we will be distributing that to the finance committee this evening as well.
Okay. Thank you. We have one set of minutes tonight. Do we?
Yes.
Okay. The Quad Board meeting of Tuesday, January 17th, 2023. I'll entertain a motion when someone is ready.
Madam Chair,
Mr. Ward,
move to approve the January 17th, 2023 Quad Board meeting minutes as written.
thank you. Do I have a second?
Second.
Motion made and seconded. Any further discussion? Seeing and hearing none, all in favor say aye,
Aye.
and the chair votes aye. We do have this evening executive session. I move that the board go into executive session, Mass General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 21A, subsection 2, to conduct strategy sessions in preparation for negotiations with non-union personnel, or to conduct collective bargaining sessions or contract negotiations for non-union personnel. Discussion is the town manager's FY24 contract, and to reconvene in open session for the sole purpose of adjournment.
Second.
Thank you. Made and seconded. Roll call vote. Mrs. Salter?
Aye.
Mr. Ward?
Aye.
Mrs. Anderson?
Aye.
Mrs. Lapointe?
Aye.
And chair votes aye. We are in executive session at 6:55. Thank you.